So, talk of a minority government and possible coalition governments or formal arrangements between parties. What should we expect 6 days from now if Canadians do elect a minority parliament? Duane Bratt is a political science professor and chair in the Department of Economics, Justice and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University in Calgary. Professor Bratt, good to see you again. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
Why are we hearing this talk about possible coalitions now?
Well, we're hearing it for a couple of reasons. One is the polls are showing a dead heat. We're also seeing the rise of both the NDP and especially the Bloc. Anytime there's been a strong Bloc, you're dealing with a minority situation. And finally, you've got leaders, especially Jagmeet Singh, talking about working with the Liberals. Elizabeth May has mused about working with the Liberals, but with certain conditions. So those are the reasons we're spending a lot of time talking about minority governments right now.
What do you make of the fact that Jagmeet Singh brings it up rather kind of enthusiastically in response to a question on the weekend, and now he's kind of backpedaling? What do you make of that? Does that mean it's not a focus, he's not interested anymore, or is he trying to sort of...
No, I mean, it's always complicated talking about minority situations before it actually happens. And you can see that quite quickly, the Conservatives jumped on this. And, just as they did in 2008, when there was a coalition of Liberals and NDP and Bloc that were about to defeat the Conservative government on a non-confidence vote, they prorogued Parliament and they referred to that coalition as the coalition of losers, socialists, and separatists. And so the moment that Singh started talking about coalition, the Conservatives went out and said, see, this shows that the only stability is to vote Conservative. I think the Liberals would like NDP support in the case of minority government, but they don't like them talking about it in the middle of an election campaign.
All right, let's be clear on the terms, because there are several kinds of party cooperation in a minority parliament. What do we mean by a coalition, and have we ever seen it in Canada?
So what I mean by a coalition, in a specific sense, is when you have a cabinet made up of members of different parties. This is common in Europe in their PR system, but very rare in Canada. The only instance that I'm aware of was in World War I. Robert Borden formed a unity government with English-speaking members of the Liberal Party. And that's been the only time we've had a formal coalition. Instead, what we have seen are two other examples. One are written agreements. That's when the smaller party will negotiate an agreement with a larger party and say, we will work together for 2 years, but here are the conditions. And we saw that in 1985 when David Peterson, the Liberal leader, worked out an agreement with Bob Rae, the NDP leader, and they formed a government. Same thing in British Columbia in 2017. The NDP negotiated an agreement with the Greens and allowed them to govern. What was interesting of both of those situations is the Conservatives in 1985 actually had a plurality of seats. But when the Liberals and the NDP got together, they then had a majority of seats.
Right.
Same thing in British Columbia in 2017. The Liberal Party had a plurality of seats, but not enough when you combine the Green and the NDP.
I mean, and then we've also seen, and I think you're going to get to that, we've seen minority governments last surprisingly long time in this country just by getting smaller parties to support individual confidence measures, such as a speech from the throne or a budget. I think we're more used to that, certainly in the last 15 years in this country, because we saw it with Stephen Harper.
In that more informal mechanism. So in 72 to 74, the NDP supported the Liberals without a written agreement. There were specific policies that they wanted, and when the Liberals decided enough was enough, they put in a budget bill that forced the NDP to vote against it, and forced the Conservatives to vote against it. We went to the polls. Stephen Harper was very good in his period of minority rule from 2006 to 2011, where he would tack to the Liberals sometimes and tack to the NDP at other times, sometimes promising them something for support, in other cases simply daring them to call an election when the Liberals in particular didn't have a leader. And so to see how this arrangement would work, what we could have happen on Monday is having 6 parties and perhaps an independent or two. That is going to even complicate things even more.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, you mentioned Could we see some of those same dynamics at play? Because then not only do you look at who's won how many seats and the possibilities for who can make deals, who can form government, but then you also have to consider these notions, right? If not, who's ready for another election fairly quickly?
Oh, absolutely.
Who's got the deep pockets? Who we might have some leadership questions immediately after the vote. Who stays? Who goes? So all of those are factors, right?
A lot of the questions are going to depend upon what the actual seat count is. Is it very close? In 72, there are only 2-seat difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives. But what happens if it's 20 or 30 seat difference? Then are we likely to see that leader who's down 20 to 30 seats is forced to resign by his own party? We also have to look at the dynamics. Does one party simply need the support of one additional party to get a majority of seats, or do they require more than one party? So if the Liberals and the NDP combine equal 50% plus one, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. But what happens if the Liberals and the NDP are shy of that? Does it then revolve around, the Liberals and the NDP and the Reform, or not the Reform Party, the Green Party? And then you've got the Bloc. The problem with the Bloc is it's tough for any party to work with them. They've toned down the separatism, but they're still a separatist party, especially in the rest of Canada. And so working with them is delicate for anybody.
I think people can see how if the Liberals were to win a minority, you can see a path to governing with support from the NDP and maybe even the Greens. Can you see a path to governing if Andrew Scheer wins a minority? If it's a minority parliament with Andrew Scheer trying to form a government?
No, it would be very difficult. It could be, and you're already seeing conservative strategists talk about
they need a majority.
How illegitimate if the Conservatives win a plurality and someone else forms government, that would be undemocratic. I think what you could see is, in that sort of scenario, because it's tough to find a dance partner for the Conservatives. It's tough for them to work with the Bloc, as I mentioned, and the People's Party. I mean, there's a reason the People's Party was created, and that's the animosity that Bernier and Scheer have towards one another. So who do the Conservatives work with? What the Conservatives may want is for a new election and to be able to say, it's either a Conservative majority government or it's chaos, similar to what we saw during the 1920s when it was, the infamous King Byng affair, where it was king or chaos. Right. It could be Conservatives or chaos.
1926. Let's finish on this. The country's already polarized heading into voting day. And I'm wondering for some final thoughts for you, how you think those divisions might be made worse if we end up with a minority parliament on Monday.
Would be reflected in a minority parliament. Right? So it wouldn't create the divisions, it would reflect those divisions. And those divisions don't just exist party to party, they exist region to region. And so we could be in a much more difficult spot with a minority situation in 2019 than when we had a minority in 2004 or 2006 or 2008, because there's more parties at play now.
All right. Duane Bratt, always good to get your perspective. Thanks again for that today, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, you're welcome.